Thanks, Michelle. So my name's Sue Davis. I work at CQ University, Central Queensland Uni, but at the Sunshine Coast campus at Noosa. And in fact, in the early, well, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, no, what was it, 10 years ago, I was on the Noosa Biosphere board, on the cultural board. I was chair of that and then became chair of Noosa Biosphere Limited. And so that was the earlier iteration of the management structure for Noosa Biosphere. And in fact, I think it played a really important role with the community sector boards, because people like me, I've come at this, while I love the environment and nature, I live on 6 acres at Yamundi that we've revegetated. I actually came at this through arts and culture. And so this is a passion project, I guess, that's grown over the last 5 years or so, but emerged out of discussions and activities from Floating Land Exhibition, which is art and environment in the Noosa area from the early 2010s. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who are the women, some of the women I call wildflower women, because they started with a passion for native wildflowers, particularly of the Wallam areas on the Sunshine Coast and across southeast Queensland. But through their love of the Wallam and the wildflowers, engaged in various forms of arts practice, but that led to activism. And in fact, they were responsible for leading campaigns to have established some really significant national parks and reserves in the area. And I think it's really important to recognise that governments have never just gone, oh, let's declare a national park. That'd be a nice thing to do. That's not what's happened. And in fact, behind the name and history of every national park, there are people and groups of people who've fought very hard usually to have those designations come about. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Sunshine Coast area. I'm on Kabi country. And their long history of being custodians of country, but also these other people since who've actually continued on some of those relational, caring kind of concerns for environment to actually ensure we can still enjoy it today. So a lot of my work has been focused on Kathleen MacArthur, and I'll talk a little bit about her later, and a whole lot of other people who she worked with or she influenced, and work that still continues on today. So these are some of the areas that I adore. I spend as much time as I can in some of the plants that I've come to discover and learn about in the last few years. So Kathleen MacArthur Reserve near Curramundi, Girraween Reserve behind Sunrise Beach, the Arthur Harold Reserve and Kahlua section of the Great Sandy National Park, Noosa North Shore. But I came to learn about these places and these plants largely through arts, poetry and story. And that's one of Kathleen MacArthur's artworks on the left of Vanilla Lily. And in fact, when I first saw that image, I'd never even seen one in the wild. And part of me was going, do these flowers still grow in the area? Where are they? How come I don't know about them? And so over the last few years, it's become a journey for me learning about these, but it's also been through art, through taking photos, and also through learning to actually draw and capture these, some of these flowers myself. And there's incredible amount you can learn when you go about drawing and trying to capture a flower or a plant, that it's quite different to learning through perhaps scientific or biological means. And so that's why I think, in terms of if we want people to learn about our bioregion and care about it and then protect it and act to protect it, that arts and culture plays a very important role. And they're the things that Kathleen MacArthur and Judith Wright were saying 60, 70 years ago. So Kathleen MacArthur was born in 1915, coincidentally the same year as the woman who was to become a very firm friend, Judith Wright. They were born 6 months apart. And Kathleen lived on the Sunshine Coast for 50 or more years. And in fact, her contributions were recognised to the degree that at the end of the 20th century, she was named Sunshine Coast's Citizen of the Century, not just the year or the decade, but the century. So as I mentioned, a friendship that really they really informed each other, encouraged each other. Really seminal friendship was with Judith Wright, and that started in the early 1950s. So one of the things, I guess, that encapsulates then what Kathleen was on about is this quote, and I think it's a really kind of classic one. And she was talking about, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, when all of that territory north of Curramundi up through Bocarina, Kawana, all of that was wildflower country, but people just didn't see it for what it was. They thought it should be cleared, it was just rubbish land, it was full of, you know, mosquitoes and pests, so they didn't value it. And so she said, because our flowers have never settled into our consciousness, they're not seen. People can drive through square miles of colourful mass display of bloom and simply not see it. It's only when the mind opens that the flowers bloom. And so for her, all of what she did was really about educating people through her art, through her activism, so that people would learn, care about, and then want to protect it. So this is the only known photograph of Judith and Kathleen in the same image, because they both used to take the photos, and this is on those plains north of Curramundi in about the 1960s. And that is, those flowers there are all Christmas bells. And what they loved to do together in the 50s was what they called wild flowering. And that was about wandering country, discovering what was there. And that inspired, particularly at that time, you know, for Kathleen, it was her art. For Judith, it was her poetry. And it was before they started taking on a largely public and activist role. And that's one of Kathleen's photographs also of some of those plains, where the Christmas bells were so prolific, they used to be harvested and sent to Brisbane to be sold at the markets, but not so now. One of her photographs, and that's one of her beautiful watercolour paintings. So this respect and understanding of the importance of culture and engaging people's emotions, both of them talked about at different times. So really recognising that if you wanted to bring about that commitment and get people to sort of care about country, you had to activate, you know, their hearts and souls and get through to their emotions. So Kathleen, it's got to be acknowledged, they both came from quite privileged backgrounds. So Kathleen MacArthur was the daughter of Daniel Evans, who was one of the two of Evans Deakin Industries. And so they were sort of a leading industrialist family in the early 20th century in Queensland, behind the steel for the Story Bridge, the dockyards at Kangaroo Point, etc., etc. And her mother was a Durack. Her cousin was Dame Mary Durack. And so this was their home, Cardington at Coorparoo. But they also built a house at Caloundra in about 1936, and that house is still there today. And her father was also a colonel in the army, and so he was stationed there throughout World War II, and well, he served in World War I as well. But Caloundra in those days was actually, there was a whole lot going on. The governor also had a house there, and so it was a real social scene during World War II. And that's Kathleen there on the beach there as well. So it was from Caloundra at that time, the profusion of wildflowers was such that she really wanted to find out what they were. And this friend, Beryl Kennedy, actually played a key role in, they used to go for these walks from Caloundra over to Dickey Beach and Curramundi. And Beryl helped her learn about the names of the flowers. And another person who was quite important and an early wildflower woman was this woman, Estelle Thompson, who in the 20s and 30s also, they had a beach house at Caloundra as well. Her husband was in the army, and she published a very early volume of Queensland native plants that Kathleen found was one of the only ones that documented them at the time. Now, there's some interesting connections here as well. So Estelle Thompson at one stage was also president of the Queensland Naturalists Club. They were one of the very early environmental groups. 1906 they were established and still go today. And that's a photo on the left of her at Caloundra with Frida Beige, who was from the Women's College, UQ. So some very powerful, influential women who had this very early commitment to the environment and particularly to the wildflowers. And that's the cover of Estelle's book. Other people who they knew and key sort of literary figures at the time were Nettie and Vance Palmer. They lived in Caloundra in the late 20s. They used to come back in the 50s still. Vance's sister Emily married a Bulcock, and she was also a Queensland poet. And they both also wrote beautifully about the wildflowers and around the Caloundra area. Another woman who must be acknowledged is Sylvia Fox, née Dalton, Aboriginal woman who was Kathleen's washerwoman in the 40s at Caloundra, and she taught Kathleen the names, the Indigenous names of many plants, including the midgeonberry, and that was what Kathleen named her house. It was called Midgeon at Caloundra. So this is a really important photo. So I must acknowledge family members. So this collection of photographs over the last 5 years has been collected from Kathleen's daughter, Alexandra, her son, Hugh, Judy Nelson Gracie, her sister, who's still alive, and nephew and niece. So a whole lot of family members. This, Alexandra had this and didn't even realise she had it. This is a really seminal moment. So in 1953, Judith Wright was visiting Kathleen MacArthur, and they went for a drive, and they climbed to the top of Mount Timbiwa. So that's Judith Wright McKinney with her daughter Meredith. And at this time, they both wrote independently saying, looking north, they looked at, you know, up Laguna Bay, up to Rainbow Beach, Fraser Island, and said, this would make a great national park. After that time, Judith Wright went to Brisbane. She spoke to Romeo Lay from National Parks Association, I believe it was, and he said it wouldn't need to be protected, it would be fine, and they were more interested in rainforests. But what they discovered was that there were in fact mining leases pending over most of that territory, and that really came to the fore in the 60s. After that particular day, Judith and her husband and daughter, they went up to Boreen Point, and there in fact fell in love with a little cottage that they bought, and that was their holiday home for many years. And that's a photo of Meredith McKinney at Boreen Point, and that's Judith and their house. But a seminal event after that was in 1962, when David Flay wrote letters to Judith Wright and Kathleen saying that they needed to educate kids more about the environment. And then Brian Closton from Jacaranda Press offered to publish a magazine if they were on board. And then they realised to do that they needed an organisation, so they formed the Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, and they were the founding members. Of course, they had a range of campaigns within Queensland and nationally, but a really significant early one led to the establishment of Cooloola National Park. And while I guess in Noosa history, people probably most often hear about Arthur Harold's role and the Cooloola Committee, and they did indeed play a very important role in following through. But the person and the people who started it was really Kathleen MacArthur, and even Arthur Harold acknowledges that. So they discovered that much of the area had mining leases over it, and they didn't know what to do. So Kathleen, there'd been a postcard sent from America. Other people at the society couldn't see a use for it, but she did. So she advocated that they create this flyer, brochure and a postcard, and a very ambitious campaign. So 100,000 of these postcards were printed, and then she researched every environmental group across the country, sent them all over the nation, inviting people to send the postcards back to Joe Bjelke-Petersen, Premier at the time, and certainly not noted for his love and care for the environment. It's not known exactly how many got back. I believe Micah Hearn asked that they be kept, maybe 15,000, but I contacted the Queensland Archives and they couldn't find them. But anyway, it gained nationwide coverage across the media. they and Kathleen, these are actually documents from the State Library, letters poured in from all over the country. But she also used her art. And so on the brochure, you have a verse of Judith Wright's At Cooloola, but Kathleen also produced a postcard, these Cooloola wildflowers, that was also sold to help raise funds for the campaign. So this is just interesting, an article where Arthur Harold actually acknowledges that it was Kathleen who had the cunning mind behind the postcards to the Premier campaign. I first met Kathleen in 1962. 6 months later, when I was thinking of starting up MPA, I turned to her. So it's true though that after that, it was the campaign from the 70s on was led by the Cooloola Committee, which came out of the establishment of the South Queensland Conservation Council in 1969. And people like Arthur Harold, but also Bill and Mavis Huxley played a very important role in seeing that through. Kathleen also started wildflower shows in 1967, and that really has continued on now through the Wildflower Festival, which is still run every year, August, September, across Sunshine Coast and Noosa. She published a range of books that both focused on wildflowers, but also specific environments and issues across the coast. And she also, in the 70s, that you'll see top right, the Pumicestone Passage book, she led the campaign, I guess, to get Pumicestone Passage on the National Heritage Register. Other people who were influenced by her as well, that's Nancy Cato on the far right. So you've got Judy Nelson Gracie, Kathleen, daughter Alexandra, Mary Durack, and you've got Nancy Cato there. And of course, Nancy then went on to write the Noosa story, identifying problems going on at Noosa at the time with development. But of course, acknowledging there's been many other people since who've acted to protect the environment and help, you know, establish national parks and that. Elaine Green's book, top right, is a really fabulous one for some other stories from across the Sunshine Coast. Other people like Cecily Fernley used to write weekly columns. Elizabeth McDonald's book is also worthwhile. And of course, in more recent times, people like Stephanie Haslam and her work with Noosa native plants. You've got Jill Chamberlain there, down bottom right. Marie Pryor, bless her soul, Lindy Orwin, people who continue this work up in Cooloola region as well. And of course, the Sunshine Coast branch of the Queensland Wildlife Preservation Society continues today. They still do amazing work and still turn up at council meetings and keep them honest. And it's amazing that they keep going. And these are some of Kathleen's relatives, Judy's daughter, Wendy Gordon, and her husband, Gerard. They've been very involved in campaigns, for example, so that there wasn't a chairlift to Mount Coolum, saving Urumba from the Sekasui House development. And, you know, they continue in those efforts today. Kathleen MacArthur Reserve was, of course, established after her death, but it was one of the areas she had identified was really worth protecting. And that's one of the places I love going to. Very special place. So, as I said, I'm not an environmentalist. I come from the art side. So we've, to date, co-curated 2 exhibitions that started with Kathleen's work. The more recent one included contemporary Sunshine Coast artists as well. And that was at the opening in 2018. And then later this year, we're having one at, hopefully, Gympie Regional Gallery. And that will include Cooloola artists as well. And it's very much about contemporary approaches to the Wallam, the wildflowers, plus also these stories. So many people who live and come to the coast, who care about the environment, are also creative and vice versa. So I guess just in concluding, it's just recognising the important role of arts and culture as well in this whole process of helping people know about, learn, care, create, and then act to protect these important and very special natural environments. That's a whole lot of people I've gathered stuff from.